Hi folks, back with our look at active and post-conflict and education inequity. We have just been talking about this quote from Peter Buckland at the World Bank about education's role in conflict and that it might contribute to the factors that underlie conflict, but also has the potential to significantly influence the building of peace. All right. Well, a couple of things that we should recognize, and I'm using UNESCO data and references here. We know that on average, oh poop, hold on, let me get my clicker back up. We know that on average, 29% of all conflict-affected countries rank among the 20 lowest achievers in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, compared to only 8% of all non-conflict countries. All right. So that is important to understand, is that conflict-affected countries are among the lowest achievers in the MDGs. These means they are disadvantaged in many, many different areas. So conflict-affected countries versus non-conflict-affected countries. And what we really want to do is look at this percentage, right? Because there's a lot larger number in the non-conflict than in the conflict affected. So these numbers are not really as comparable as these numbers are. All right. Underweight prevalence in children. 27% of conflict affected countries have this as a problem. Only 8% of non-conflict. Primary school net enrollment attendance ratio. 30% of conflict affected countries have this as a problem. Whereas only 8% in the conflict. Gender parity in primary school, 30% versus 8%. Under 5 mortality rate, 27 versus 8. And you can see that it goes on down the line. We have double-digit problems as a proportion of all conflict-affected countries, but we only have single digits in terms of the percentage or proportion of non-conflict countries that are low achievers in terms of each of these 7 Millennium Development Goals. All right? The average, when we look at the average, is 29% versus 8%. 29% of conflict-affected countries are among the lowest achievers in the Millennium Development Goals compared to only 8 in non-conflict situations. That is an enormous difference. And so we have to recognize that there are extreme issues of inequality that already exist in conflict-affected countries, much more so and at a much higher rate than we see in non-conflict countries. So our issue of whether or not education plays any role in armed conflict is actually a really interesting one, because well, on the one hand, education might be helping a situation. However, it would be hard to tell if education hasn't made an impact or made any inroads in the country because of the disadvantage that exists there. Let's think about some characteristics of education in conflict and post-conflict communities. One is that education systems are almost always complicit in conflict. By being complicit in conflict means that these education systems will not actively resist conflict. In fact, if anything, they are often used by ruling parties or dominant groups or resistance militias to, for lack of a better word, in some cases brainwash, but often skew communities and particularly the youth that are in schools towards whatever that group's ideology or agenda is. So if these are kids that live and go to school in a community that is largely populated by militia members, then guess what? The schools are going to be complicit in promoting the agenda of the militia. If they live in communities that are largely government-controlled areas, then the schools are going to be complicit in pushing the agenda of the government, whether the government is good or bad, whether the militia is good or bad. The fact is that education systems are complicit in conflict in most cases. We also know schools can reproduce the skills, values, attitudes, and social relations of dominant groups. That's not a shock. We know that's true in every situation and in every community around the world. However, it becomes even more important when we're talking about the kinds of communities that are such low achievers and such disadvantaged groups. So if schools are reproducing inequality in those already disadvantaged communities, that means that the gap is just widening, right? Education systems rarely completely cease to function in conflict situations. That is actually a really interesting fact, and one that I find, quite frankly, surprising. Now, in the case of child soldiers, the children who are, or the youth who are child soldiers, will probably not be attending school, and those will be out of school youth in that case. But the education system itself generally continues to function even though there's conflict going on. And that, I think, all by itself is a phenomena worth exploring. Now, why wouldn't the education system stop especially if there's active conflict that's going on? Why do people continue to send their kids to school? Well, that's a really important question. Is it because of the stability that education systems offer in terms of maybe it's a safe place to go, maybe there's food or clothing there or health services there, maybe the importance of education becomes enhanced when conflict situations arise because education can be a pathway to mobility out of a community? I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas. There are a lot of different ways we can think about it. I don't know what you think about it, but we do know that education systems continue to function in many conflict situations. Next, education systems rapidly resume operations with or without outside support as violence subsides. In other words, education systems that may have been put on hold or cease to function during conflict will rapidly resume whatever they were doing, even if they don't get support from outside, even if there isn't a United Nations organization or a local NGO or a large donor that's providing some sort of So there means that there are organizations that certainly will provide support for resuming education systems, but the education systems themselves come back to life either because of popular request, because they are considered an important part of the social machinery. There are lots of reasons why, but isn't it interesting that education systems do resume operations so quickly, whether they're supported from outside or not? Finally, disruption caused by conflict offers opportunities as well as challenges for social reconstruction. Now that is an interesting point. If there is some sort of disruption in the economic, political, or social system, conflict can offer opportunities for social reconstruction as well as challenges. In other words, it may be a way to break down divisions that have existed for a long time and to reconcile the opposing groups or factors as a result of the conflict. Maybe the conflict leads to resolution. On the other hand, maybe it solidifies existing differences or polarizes identities or agendas. Right? So there can be a double-edged sword when it comes to conflict and social reconstruction. Now, a key question for us to consider at this point is, what are some problems that are common to post-conflict states and education systems? All right, well, let's talk about it. I have several problems common to post-conflict or active conflict states and education systems. One is the inability of recovering states to fund either capital or recurrent expenditure. In other words, during conflict situations, there aren't a lot of countries' governments that are going to have access to some sort of revenue system that can keep the systems running, which is why it's even more remarkable that education systems continue to flourish either during conflict or to quickly reboot after conflict, because it often isn't with the state's support. Second, chronic shortages of qualified teachers do tend to occur because a lot of them have been killed or have fled, or those who remain or return are snapped up by international agencies or NGOs to do work for them. So you have serious attrition problems due to people being killed as part of the conflict, or actually running away from the situation, or people being or moving out of the education system as teachers and into international agencies or NGOs. You'll often see an oversupply of underqualified or even unqualified teachers in conflict and post-conflict situations, because as those who are qualified are killed or fled or move over to a different sector, the jobs that they leave vacant, it's like a vacuum sucking in people who need an income or want responsibility or have some sort of, they need to be involved in order to support their family or themselves or whatever. And their qualifications may be horrific. In fact, they may have none. But you're going to have a lot of people who are going to say, I can do this. And part of the reason for that is everyone, almost everyone anyway, has some sort of experience with the school or as part of an education system. And so it's not as foreign a position or a job as, say, being a doctor might be. Other problems. The sheer numbers of war-affected youth, demobilized soldiers, and young people who have not completed basic education can be a little bit overwhelming. I mean, the special needs and special problems that young people or youth that have been affected by war or armed conflict or have been actually soldiers, whether child soldiers or not, those are incredible obstacles to overcome, and there are so many of them, and there are so little public services that are going to be offered to deal with the special needs that these groups have. Often in conflict and post-conflict situations, there has been or will be poor record keeping, corruption, and a lack of transparency in education governance, where salaries are often going to be paid to ghost teachers as a way to funnel money to groups that are either being bribed or paid off or whatever. Poor record keeping, that's an understatement. Records are going to go out the window, because the first thing to flee when there are conflict situations are often the people who are responsible for keeping the records and making sure that the system is being documented. That tends to have a pretty low priority when people are being shot or killed or rounded up or whatever the conflict might be. The relief bubble in international finance support often subsides before a more predictable flow of reconstruction resources can be mobilized. In other words, relief organizations will scale back operations before there are other agencies whose funds can be mobilized. So there is going to generally be a lag in financial support. Once the conflict stops, well, a lot of the international organizations or relief organizations consider that to be the end of their responsibility. Their responsibility was to see people through the conflict situation, and once the active conflict is ended, so does their support. And it may take a while before reconstruction resources can be mobilized from other relief organizations that tend to want to support the reconstruction process. So part of this is a problem of the way that international organizations operate, because they tend to see themselves as specialized around particular situations or services. And if the situation or services that a particular group offers have to do with active conflict but not post-conflict, then as soon as the active conflict ends, they're going to end. But it will take a while for those international organizations that focus on post-conflict reconstruction to kick in their support, if their support is coming at all. Skills training for youth is seriously under-resourced. Even when available, vocational training programs often fail to prepare people for locally available employment opportunities. So any sort of training that is going to help youth with the school-to-work transition is going to be lacking. Right? And it probably wasn't there beforehand either, but it's going to be even worse after a conflict situation, because youth are going to have even less chance of receiving an education that is at least a comprehensive or a general education, not even mentioning a specialized or a vocational education. And the training programs that might have been active, even if they were possible, will probably not have prepared youth for particular employment opportunities in their community. They might train them more broadly for how to operate a particular machinery or computer system, or a skill related to agriculture or engineering or something like that, that might not have a local outlet or a local employment opportunity. There are going to be coordination challenges. As education involves an interface of humanitarian action and development in complex ways, there is often a plethora of coordination mechanisms. So it's very hard in a post-conflict situation when organizational disarray reigns supreme. It's very hard to coordinate